Hello and welcome to Two Words Wolves Pod. I'm Ryan Eichton, and with me is Andrew Carlson from Canis Hoopus. Andrew, how you doing?
Doing well, Ryan. I think last time I was on, we talked about how Giannis probably needs to get traded out of Milwaukee, and whether that was going to happen or not going to happen. Here we are, and we sit on February 6th, and he's on the Milwaukee Bucks roster, and pretty gladly from some of the tweets that he has been putting out. So I guess it's a sign of the time in between appearances.
Yeah, we'll save the Giannis topic for the middle of this podcast here, but yeah, an unsuccessful wooing of Giannis Antetokounmpo during the deadline. Still haven't. Well, when the big J journalists kind of weigh in on the reporting on what happened there, that'll be interesting. But didn't seem like the Wolves ended up, or really any team ended up being all that close in wooing the Bucks to part with their franchise legend, but. The Wolves did make a couple trades at the deadline. They did trade Mike Conley for cash considerations. And as much as I'd like to do the Mike Conley retrospective, the Mike Conley eulogy, Mike Conley is going to be back on this roster shortly because Chicago then traded Mike Conley to a third team. That makes the Wolves not the most recent team that has traded Mike Conley, meaning that he's eligible to return on a veteran minimum buyout deal. So that will be what happens. The math I've kind of done, and could be wrong, is that the Wolves will try to stay under the first apron, which they got under by sending out Mike Conley's $10 million deal. But they want to stay below that apron, so they'll have to wait until after the All-Star break to sign Mike, as well as one more veteran minimum to stay under that apron. All of that is kind of window dressing because they got under the apron, save the owners a bunch of money. We'll talk about how much it affected the Ayo Dosunmu trade. But yeah, Andrew, do you have any thoughts just before we move on to the actual big trade of the Wolves deadline, just on the Mike Conley trade and then return?
No, I think it's a move that needed to happen with Mike. It was the elephant in the room that if you're getting paid $11 million and you're not really contributing substantially to the bench and the overall production of the team, it might warrant a tough conversation. And ultimately, I think that's the best. What happened is the best outcome for everybody. Mike gets to stay. He doesn't have to move his family. He stays in the Twin Cities, a place that he's gotten acclimated to and has enjoyed over the last few years. And also for the Wolves, you're paying Mike essentially what he's worth at this point in time, in what he's going to bring to the lineup. I think it was an inevitability after the season that even if he were to stay on this $11 million salary, he's probably going to be somewhere in that Joe Ingles role next year if he wanted to continue playing. Like, he's probably going to re-sign for a minimum, and he's probably not going to play very much. So I think that what happened here just kind of expedited that. And again, like you said, there's tax implications. I'm not a cap guy. I'm not as smart as you and some of the other people that are on Twitter breaking some of this down. But that is a very important thing for future trades and what this team is able to do. So overall, on the Mike Conley stuff, I think this is the best possible outcome. A little bummed to see him initially go to Chicago because I thought maybe that the Bulls would maybe make him report based on just the roster of how many young guys they have and just kind of the weirdness of that franchise currently. They might need like a stabilizing veteran presence, but once he got dealt to Charlotte, I mean, I think everybody knew that was going to be an option for him to return to Minnesota, and I think ultimately it's the best for every single party involved.
Yeah, and I guess I should mention that the Wolves did give up a first-round pick swap in this upcoming draft for this trade. What that amounts to is it's with Detroit, so Detroit will end up getting the better of the Wolves and the Pistons pick. Right now, that's like the difference between 22 and the 29th pick. So not meaningless, but also not something that I feel is worth getting too worked up about either. Or the Wolves could just go on a big winning streak and not even have to pick swap and have the worst pick straight up. But I doubt that. I highly doubt that'll happen. But what the Mike Conley did in part open up for the Wolves is a trade for another player. Getting under the first apron meant that they could take in more money than they sent out. That's like one of the rules of the first apron of being over it, is that you can't take out can't receive more than a single dollar above what you send out in a trade. So the Wolves take in about like $1 million more in this trade. They send out Rob Dillingham and Leonard Miller, and we'll kind of do the Rob Dillingham retrospective after this. But they get back Ayo Dosunmu and Julian Phillips from the Bulls, as well as the Wolves send out 4 second-round picks, one of which is like this upcoming draft where it's like the worst of a bunch of teams, including Denver. So that's going to be like the 55th pick. And the three other second-round picks are more real than that. But ultimately, for not much cost, the Wolves get a player that I think is going to help them a lot. Just like the exact type of player. And kind of, we'll talk about the Giannis trade, kind of the type of trade that made me not worried about sending out a whole bunch of talent for Giannis, just because I think you can get these type of players relatively cheaply, but we'll save that for later in the pod. They get a guy that just matches exactly what they need. We can talk about like the differences between him and Nikhil, but in terms of role and quality of player, like the perfect Nikhil replacement. I hadn't, I guess I hadn't done enough research into Ayo Dosunmu. I hadn't realized like he's shooting 45% from 3 on relatively low volume, 4 attempts a game, but like he's scoring 15 points a game. And that we've watched so much, especially like with Bones up and down play, and like they're playing the Bones the minimum. That's what you get on a minimum. But with how much they just don't have any bench scoring, it's been just Naz Reid, and that's just, and the minute Naz has a bad game, which like every player has a bad game, obviously, like the Wolves lose because they're getting 0 production on their bench. And immediately I think the Wolves fix that area. The biggest gap between this year and last year's team, I kind of do still think this team pre-deadline was still better than last year's team. But if you were to, like, any gap was missing this type of player, a bench scorer, he can shoot the lights out. I mean, listen, is 45% going to kind of similar with Jaden? Do we expect these guys to shoot 45% moving forward? Probably not, but he's a 37.7% three-point shooter for his career. Is that number realistic? Yeah, probably. Maybe you tick that up or you increase the volume a little bit and stick around 37%. He can make a bunch of shots, and then he's an athletic guy that can straight line drive. If he's playing minutes with Ant, when the attention focuses on Ant, he can attack those gaps, which has been exactly what this Wolves team has needed last year, and the year before. The differences with Nikhil, I would say, are Nikhil is a much better defender, and Dosunmu is probably much better just a guard attacking, like a scoring player, in that sort of way, although Nikhil has kind of improved that since his time in Minnesota, since signing with Atlanta. So that's kind of my thoughts on Dosunmu. What do you got, Andrew?
Yeah, I think Dosunmu brings a little bit more of an assertive presence than Nikhil did. I think Nikhil was more of a let's fill in the gaps of and do at an elite level what the game needs, whether it's spot up shooting, whether it's on ball defense. I'm just going to be the ultimate gap filler, and win games that way. Obviously, that's changed now that he's in Atlanta, but when he was with the Wolves, it felt like that was kind of more what he was. Now with Dosunmu coming in, you have a much more dominant ball handler, much more willing playmaker. I think the thing with Nikhil was that, and I don't want to make this sound like Dosunmu was like worlds better than Nikhil or anything like that, but it's just a different player. With Nikhil, he couldn't really get picked up 94 feet. He couldn't really bring the ball up, and he had a hard time initiating the offense, being the dominant on-ball guard with the Wolves. This is something that Ayo Dosunmu is used to, and he's done it dating back to Illinois when he was one of the best players in the country in college. So it's just a different player. He's a good defender. He's not a great defender, but he brings a very fiery mentality that the bench just so desperately lacked. And just kind of looking through some of the Bulls lineup combination numbers, I mean, this is minimum of 150 minutes, but I mean, Dosunmu is involved in 3 of the top 6 3-man lineups for the Bulls this year, and 3 of those lineups have a net rating of at least 9. One of them, I believe, has a 20 net rating. That's when he's on the floor with Matash Buzelis and Jalen Smith. So he brings, like, he is like a net rating guy. Like, he's a net rating darling. Now, obviously, the Bulls stunk, and the net rating is kind of a tough stat with a team like that. But I think it tells you a lot about the type of player he is. I think the other thing with this trade is it does tell you that, I mean, obviously the Wolves and Bulls were rumored for a pretty long time to maybe do business together around the trade deadline, with how many guards the Bulls had, with the expiring contracts the Bulls had, and just the willing players that they were probably going to be. This told me that Dosunmu all along was probably higher on the Wolves list than Kobe White was. I know Kobe White was maybe more rumored, and that was kind of all over Twitter and what have you. But this tells me that Dosunmu was someone who was a little bit higher on their wish list for a couple reasons. One, they could have had Kobe White in the Mike Conley trade, and they passed. I believe they did that probably because they had a sense of what Ayo Dosunmu's market was, and that they would be able to meet that at a later time if the Giannis thing didn't really work out. And two, I think Dosunmu is a world's better defender than Kobe White, and is a different player too. I think if the Bulls were better, Ayo is probably in the sixth man of the year conversation a little bit more. But I think just with his volume that he's able to play at, the ability for him to come off the bench and not have the expectation of being a starter, and his a little bit more fiery nature and ability to play defense, I think those are things that the Wolves like a little bit more, and were, I think, to me, clear reasons why Dosunmu was higher on the Wolves' radar.
Yeah, I like that. And I think the Wolves, and they needed more like a guard / wing than like a point guard, is personally what I think, especially if they're going to bring back Mike Conley and they have Bones, and Ant is the point guard. I know people kind of get through this. Ant is the point guard of the starting unit. I have seen very little issues with that starting unit in that sort of way. So I don't think the Wolves needed more pure point guard play. Like that was more what Kobe White would bring. Where I think Dosunmu is a shooting guard. He's not a small forward. He's a guard more than a wing, but or more than a forward, I should say. But he provides a little bit more like bigger defense than White, I think. And then he, like you mentioned, like the speed going to the rim, that type of stuff. That's what the Wolves need. They need more, like, when there's gaps available, someone to attack those, versus like a Kobe White type where kind of more has like more ability to be like a point guard in matchups, where I think it was clear that the Wolves, I think they would have loved Kobe White. Like, I don't think they were like, that was a player that they were looking at, but like, it was clear after the Mike Conley trade where it was reported that basically the Wolves said no thank you to Kobe White, where it sounds like for somewhat little value, or certainly I think the second round picks that they sent out in this trade, they could have had Kobe White and they could have kept Rob. Like, that's not the path they chose to make. They went this route instead. So yeah, I agree that like Dosunmu was over White was what they preferred. I was just kind of
Kobe
glad
White was going to cost so much more in free agency too. I mean,
for sure.
For next year, I mean, I think that's also a consideration of it. I think Dosunmu, I believe I saw he's eligible for 3 years, 52 this offseason, and that's just less of a commitment than what you would probably have to make to Kobe White with what he gives you just from an offensive production standpoint on a night-to-night basis. So that for sure probably had something to do with it. While I do have the floor here, I do want to circle back to one thing that you did say about attacking the basket. I do think Ayo Dosunmu, he's about 58% at the rim, or at least in the restricted area. And that's extremely important, just because I wrote a little bit for Canis in the overall newser when the news broke, but the Wolves just didn't have that in the playoffs last year outside of Anthony Edwards. And it was so clear that if the Wolves had any shot to beat Oklahoma City in that series, that Ant was going to have to go to the rim 15 to 20 times. And the problem is he was the only player on the Wolves who was able to really do that. And he had all of that responsibility on his shoulders. And when you're getting loaded up on 2-3 guys, anytime you get close to the paint, that becomes extremely difficult, and it caused Chris Finch to need to go to Terrence Shannon. And when you're playing a rookie who doesn't otherwise get a ton of minutes in the Western Conference Finals, that shows a pretty large gap in your capabilities. And so I think what Dosunmu brings is the ability to take some of that off of Ant in a playoff series, always having some sort of a downhill force that can get to the rim and collapse defenses. And with Rudy's ability now to navigate the dunker a little bit better, and some of his offensive revitalization that's been going on, the Wolves do become a little bit more of a paint threat, bringing in Ayo Dosunmu. And in the playoffs moving forward, when you do play a team that has rangy wings and athleticism, you have more than just one option as a ball handler to get to the paint. And frankly, that was my biggest concern for this team this year. They continue to not have that, and so I think this move solves at least a little bit of that, to a degree.
Absolutely. I want to build on the extension talk because I think it's important as well. So going into next offseason, the Wolves currently have $190 million in salaries. If you take out Julian Phillips, decline his option, you're down to 187. If you draft your first round pick that you have, you're back up to like 190. But ultimately the Wolves have around, let's see here, $11 million under the luxury tax. So the Wolves could technically spend that all on a mid-level exception player. The problem is if you spend the mid-level exception, non-taxpayer mid-level exception, you're hard capped at the first apron. So you cannot go over the first apron. That basically means if you spend that $11 million on a free agent, you're not going to be able to retain Dosunmu, and you're not really going to, other than maybe Jalen Clark, you're not going to be able to get a non-minimum player. So I think if the version of the Wolves offseason that is a stand pat deadline, I kind of don't think is likely, but just go with me. If they have a stand pat deadline where they're not trading anyone of note and they're just retaining players and adding minimums on the end, Ayo Dosunmu fits exactly into that type of offseason where you're trying to retain your players while also staying under the second apron. It's almost exactly there. So I got my spreadsheet out. I kept everyone's salaries there. I just thought, like, is 3 years 52 too much for Ayo Dosunmu? I don't know. I just put in 16.8 million. That was with increasing salaries the next 2 seasons after that was roughly 352. We're keeping Berenger, we're keeping Shannon, we're drafting our first round pick, and then we're spending the taxpayer mid-level exception so that we can exceed the first apron. That's 6.1 million. So we are adding a $6 million player. So that would make next year's even deeper, as we got Berenger that may be more ready to play. We got a $6 million player. We have more salaries that at next year's deadline you could trade. And then I threw in 3 minimum salaries to get us to 14. And I look up at my little second apron space box, and it's positive $87,000. So it is like down to the number. Like they have room to sign in on taxpayer, keep their guys, select their draft pick, and retain Ayo Dosunmu. I have to imagine, maybe my numbers are wrong, I'm kind of doing it back of the napkin math here, but I have to imagine this sort of idea was thought about when they made this trade. That it's not, obviously Dosunmu is an expiring contract. He will be a free agent in the offseason, but the Wolves have the best avenue with his bird rights, meaning that they can retain him and not use, they can retain Dosunmu and have to use any of these exceptions that I'm talking about. They can just re-sign him and pay the luxury tax or whatever. And then I do believe that staying under the second apron is just going to continue to be a necessity for this franchise, because their pick, I don't remember which year, I should look it up, but like one of their picks, because they were in the second apron last year, is frozen. They cannot trade it. And now that I'm even saying this, I'm realizing it's one of the picks. It's like the pick that's frozen is a Stepien pick that that they wouldn't be able to trade anyone until draft night. So that aspect of it. But if they want it, the reason for saying I'm at the second apron is important is, like I mentioned, if they get to the next year's deadline with this team that I'm describing still intact, which I think is unlikely, but go with me, they'll want to make a trade similar to the trade that they just made now, where you'd probably be more looking like trading this $6 million player plus Shannon and whatever. It doesn't matter. That's why it's important. It's not just saving the ownership money. If you want to complain about the CBA that I enjoy the spreadsheet stuff. If you don't, totally get it. Like, it's boring spreadsheet stuff. I enjoy the boring spreadsheet stuff, but ultimately this is the landscape we're in. And clearly, I think re-signing Dosunmu in the offseason will be a priority. I also think, depending on the rest of the season goes, they're going to try to go after Giannis again, but even a lower level move that does include one of their main players would be on the table. But if it's not, the Wolves have the ability to add to this roster in the offseason. Andrew, what do you think about all the boring spreadsheet stuff?
Yeah, I leave that stuff to people who are good at it, like you. It's funny. When I was texting with a friend the other day, and I was like, the sentence "under the apron but above the tax" is such an insane thing to type out now. I think eventually, like, they just need a hard cap. Like, what are we doing here? But that's for another day, and like 6 years down the line when the CBA expires. The thing is, for the Wolves, and I completely agree with you that staying under the second apron is going to be the most important thing for this team moving forward, especially when you do have like your other out, which is Terrence Shannon. Like, this right now is a time for him to come back from his injury. He's had plenty of time to rehab and make sure that his foot is better, and come back and like show that the first part of the season was an anomaly, and that last year and his summer league performance were maybe more of who he is as a player, because he is going to be next year's Rob Dillingham if that isn't the case. Like, what can we consolidate with Terrence Shannon in order to maybe upgrade some of the bench pieces that we do have? So yeah, I mean, I 100% agree. Like, staying under the second apron for this team is extremely important. And it's going to be something that becomes even more important when it comes decision time for guys like Rudy and Julius and like some of these other big contracts that are on the books moving forward too. It's not a cost-cutting thing. I don't think that's really fair to characterize it that way. I mean, I know that was kind of like a national narrative around the Conley trade, was like, oh, they're cutting costs, they're looking to save money. I don't think that that's a really fair way to characterize it when there's more moves to be made, clearly. And also too, like, how prohibitive some of these things are when you're over the first and second apron to actual roster building efforts. I think a lot of times, like, these front offices, they also are trying to be very delicate when navigating these rules. We've seen that here for the first couple of years of the CBA. We'll see it again in free agency. We'll see it again in trade deadlines in the future, because this was a relatively dead one. And I think that that's, something that people also need to keep in mind about these first apron, second apron, whether you're above the tax, below the tax, what your tax bill is going to be. There's just a lot of moving parts to this thing. And so it's important that you are on top of it, and other people are as well, because I'm certainly not.
Yeah, hey, I get that. Like, I get that it's boring, and I get that, like, I'm not asking other people to enjoy it. I enjoy it, and I'm the nerd. Like, that's fine with me. But like, I do think like it's a big portion of it, and it allows you to understand why when they traded Mike, why it wasn't just a pure salary dump. Basically, so if they had kept Mike, they could have made this trade, but like, I don't know how important Julian Phillips was coming back in this trade, but like that, the Wolves wouldn't have been able to take him back in this trade. They would have had to make it just Dillingham and Leonard Miller for Dosunmu, and I don't who knows if Chicago would have been like, if that would have been something Chicago would have wanted. So, yeah, it's a lot of moving parts, and I'm sure even while I was talking, I was screwing around with my spreadsheet, and I had the projected number for Dosunmu wrong. Like, it's all going to like it, it's all going to come together, and like I mentioned, half of this stuff probably won't even matter because they'll try to trade for Giannis in the offseason, and players will go flying left and right, or ideally they'll win the title. And if they win the title, I would almost guarantee this will be their offseason, right? Like, they'll just they'll retain their guys, and they'll go from there. But
think about it, though. Think about how different this CBA has made the trade deadline. I mean, you had the Wolves looking for third and fourth teams to try and make this Giannis thing happen. And I know it came out afterwards that, things ultimately didn't really come that close. But, in a previous life, like in the last collective bargaining agreement, you're probably having the Warriors work directly with Milwaukee, or you're probably having the Wolves work directly with walking, maybe bring in a third team for some of that draft capital that we were talking about. But now, because of where things are at from a salary perspective, if you have two teams who are over the apron, like, you have to bring in another team who's willing to take stuff on, and even then you might have to bring another team who has an abundance of draft capital, and work with a legitimate collective in order to make these things happen. And so it just makes it so much more muddy. And heading into the offseason, and now with all of these tradable firsts that are going to start freeing up here heading into the offseason, you're probably going to be seeing a lot more 3-4 team trades that just take longer to develop.
Yep, it all makes it more difficult. Although I kind of do think, like, with the Giannis stuff, like, they just didn't have enough for Giannis, or like the Bucks weren't really willing to do it. So I don't know. Let's. I got one more Wolves topic before we dive into the Bucks of it all. So they do send out Rob Dillingham in this trade. And given Rob's current value, they did awesome with this trade, I think. Well, I think what was clear is Rob's value is near nothing. The Bulls are taking a flyer on him. I'm very interested to see how Rob looks in a new setting. I think for both the Wolves and the Bulls, and Rob, I think this is good for everyone, kind of similar to Mike. Like, this kind of just needed to happen. Rob needed to be in a place where he can make mistakes, figure it out. I just think back to what they gave up to acquire him, which was a first round pick in 2031, and then a pick swap in, I believe, 2030, or maybe it was 32. Either way, that's a hefty price for Rob Dillingham. And they did make this trade before the Cat trade, which I don't think they would have done it otherwise, because when they had Cat on the roster, they were far more up against the second aprons, all that stuff I talked about before, and adding a $6 million salary basically for free was almost impossible under the previous salary cap system. So I get that. I didn't like the pick. I didn't like the trade and the pick almost from the second it happened, but I understood the logic of it. And I get that me complaining about it now is I have hindsight at my back. But it's a huge swing and a miss, and it's a costly one. They get out of it. They did fantastic to cut their losses when they did. I think, like, they admit their mistake and they move on. That aspect of it is great. I'm retroactively looking back on it. There's a good debate on, like, Rob didn't get any minutes. How was he supposed to succeed? And versus, well, he just never played well. Like, what was, like, Finch was just supposed to play a person that was costing them, like, terribly, or just was never had an extended stretch beyond a game or two where he played well. So that's like a fair debate. I fall more on the, like, he never showed anything, even in the little limited minutes. And I don't think it was, obviously there's fair complaints about Finch not playing player XYZ, but I kind of want to just use my eyes and be like, and kind of similar with Shannon earlier in the year, it's just like, they're not good. Let me rephrase. The minutes they played were not good. They were not successful minutes. And, like, with Shannon, we hope it's just, like, mostly injury, but, like, I'm not sure what the Wolves once they made the pick, I'm not sure where the Wolves went wrong. Like, could they have played Rob more minutes here or there? Yeah, but I don't think that would have fixed this. So ultimately, I think like Chicago, I'm very interested to see how Rob looks in Chicago. Ultimately, I'm not terribly high on the rest of his career. I hope he proves me wrong. And then the last point I wanted to make is, and we'll talk about the Giannis of it all. There's a chance, we don't know how close the Wolves got. There's a chance this Rob Dillingham mistake cost them Giannis Antetokounmpo. That was the stakes that they potentially lost. The Wolves, I think, trade for Giannis becomes incredibly more enticing if they had that extra pick swap and that extra first round pick in 2031. No picks, I just think, was a tough hill for the Wolves to climb out of, because they would have had to trade. I think what was clear is they would have had to trade Jaden McDaniels, probably to like a team like Portland, who knows that they would have been interested. Sorry, we're talking about Rob. Let me save that for the next discussion. But yeah, it was a costly mistake, and I've kind of fall more on the Rob just never showed enough to kind of warrant more minutes. What are your thoughts?
No, that's actually a really good take though on Rob possibly costing them Giannis. I for me, I was the opposite. I actually really liked the move at the time. Rob was a top 5 talent in the draft
Yep.
at that very given moment. I watched him. I watched a decent amount of college basketball, and watching that backcourt with him and Reed Shepherd at Kentucky, I watched some of the best stretches of offensive basketball I've ever seen in college basketball from Rob Dillingham. There was a game they played against LSU in Baton Rouge, where Rob just took over the second half and almost single-handedly brought Kentucky to a win. And like, that's an offensive talent where he had spots on the floor, like he had size up moves that he could go to. And granted, it is the college game, but I mean, it was really, really fun to watch. And obviously, like this always could have been an outcome for Rob. I think it is the worst case scenario of what
Mm-hmm.
he could have become at draft time. But there was such a high upside there, man. And I I'm not going to say that I fell in love with him, because there were other players in the draft. I mean, I specifically loved Reed Shepherd and what like some of his very quickly translatable NBA skills were. But I always thought that Rob could have had something. And when you see the Wolves trade those picks and go get him, it's like, wow, there's clearly a hole here that needs to be filled. Rob can clearly provide at least a couple of those things. There's going to need development time for that to possibly happen. But what better of a coach than Chris Finch, who's essentially developed this whole roster of drafted players, or even veteran players who may have been on their way out of the league, and like find things that Rob is good at and bring it to this roster. And like you said, it just never happened. And he flashed his rookie year. I think the thing that's always going to be difficult for me to look back on, and who knows, this might end up being the book with Terrence Shannon. I still have some optimism there. I think that foot injury was a bigger deal than it's maybe been talked about. But with Rob, man, like he showed legitimate flashes his rookie year of like that player I watched in college, like a guy who can hit pull-up shots, like collapse defenses, throw lobs, like show actual good offensive skill. And he was giving effort defensively too. Like, sure, he was still at best a neutral on his best defensive possessions, but he wasn't just completely phoning it in. And that's kind of half the battle with NBA defense. And so that's why there was so much around him heading into this year. Like, he had the Utah game, he had that New York game, he had the Boston game last year, where you clearly saw flashes there. And what's just always going to be head scratching to me is the clear regression and lack of confidence that you saw
Mm-hmm.
this year, from last year to this year, when he was given all of the empowerment in the world over the summer. I mean, the summer league team was viewed as his and Shannon's to carry through everything. He was he was holding press availability during that time, like he was going to step into the rotation this year and do some pretty special things and build on the successes that he had last year. And it just completely fell off. and I don't know really where it went wrong. I do think it's a situation where Rob's best NBA basketball is ahead of him because, there's just an aspect to him where he's 19 years old. There is a little bit of immaturity there. Um, and I do think that there probably was something behind the scenes, not like for sure. There's only little things that you pick up on, but where he was very frustrated that he wasn't getting minutes. I mean, he saw himself as a bona fide rotation player that should be getting minutes every single night, and he wasn't getting them. And I do think that there was a little bit of friction there. And so now being in a spot where he doesn't have to worry about losing a rotation spot, he will probably be in the rotation every night, and he'll be given more of an offensive leash. You're going to see what he's made of in the NBA. And also alongside of that too, like sometimes maybe you need to have this shock to the system, a trade or a full change of scenery in order to say, hey, this is a business and it's not college basketball anymore. Nothing is really guaranteed. Sometimes like there's so many different cases of players, kind of becoming better versions of themselves after a trade, and especially after a trade to a bad team, where they can have a little bit more freedom. So I share your belief that I don't have a ton of optimism for Rob moving forward. I do think his best basketball is ahead of him, and I would not be surprised in the same note if we're talking about Rob in 5 or 6 years and we're saying, man, he's a good offensive player. Like maybe the Wolves should make the move for him at the deadline to give him a little bit of pop off the bench. So I could very well see that happening if all goes glass half full after a first 2 years of a glass half empty career.
Yeah, the disappearance of the offensive game and really just never developed like you would want it to is the confusing part, because like you mentioned, coming out of college, that was his main skill, and that was like the scoring, the shooting, all of that. And it just has like his shot is just gone. Clearly the confidence is gone. And the Wolves deserve like criticism or whatever. Like that's on the Wolves. Like there's like they deserve blame or whatever word you want to use. I kind of more default to like the player also has to put it upon themselves to like improve in that sense too. And I agree with you that like he will play his best. He will not look like this in Chicago to the same degree, but also like Finch said something that was like, if you only get 10 minutes a night, shouldn't you kill it in those 10 minutes? And that's kind of how I feel about Rob. It's like, I get that like the opportunities weren't there, but like you're a long way off from the type of player that like just gets minutes regardless of how you're playing. Unfortunately, maybe that's probably not even fair. Like I think it's like if Rob were to say none of this is fair, and with the media, he was always great. Like he was always cordial. I don't think there was any like big emotional moment that like caused a ruckus or whatever. But like
completely agree.
Like at a certain point, like you just got to kind of kill it behind the scenes, in games, all that. And there probably wasn't enough of that from what we've seen. But like you said, or like I said, I do have the element of hindsight, like not liking the move. So like we don't need to relitigate that. But like my point more when they made it would have been, I thought, and let's go back. This is pre-cat trade. So when they made the decision, although ultimately, like if you're going to make this big swing, you got to get a good player, and they didn't. So that part of it doesn't matter who is on the roster. And I also kind of feel like if Dante DiVincenzo wasn't on this roster, the big difference from Rob's point of view, the big difference between pre-cat and post-cat was the addition of Dante. If Dante wasn't on this roster, do we really feel like this Rob situation would have gone much differently? I personally don't. Like, I don't think this was a good match between Rob and the Timberwolves. And then ultimately, pre-cat, post-cat, both of these teams, I just think personally are one big move away from jumping into that like the Oklahoma City, Denver tier of teams. I think, and like that's why the offseason, I think that'll be a type of move, whether it's Giannis or someone else that they need to make. And so personally, I didn't think they were a good, solid rookie starting point guard away. And that's why I didn't like the trade, because I didn't like giving up the first round pick. And again, we'll talk about Giannis, but that was why personally I didn't like it. And again, I get the hindsight. I have the hindsight in my corner here where it didn't end up working out.
Well, and I think part of it too is, part of the criteria for me liking the trade initially was, wow, that's a lot to give up. This front office and this coaching staff must really like him and have a clear cut idea of what this is going to be. And again, like you said, it was pre-cat trade, so maybe they did. And it all kind of got blown up by that cat trade. But still, like you clearly make that move because you have a development plan. There's things that he brings that can translate right away, and it just never worked out. It's a massive miss. And while I do think that the Dosunmu trade is a huge win, like I think that this is kind of being undersold a little bit. I know Tim Legler was on Twitter yesterday, kind of talking about how he liked it. Chris Vernon talked about it a little bit too, how he really liked the move. I don't think it's being talked enough how big of a deal this move is for the Timberwolves bench. I think it single-handedly solves an issue that they've had all year and can kind of thrust them in. For me, I think it can thrust them into that Denver tier if it works out the way that, the front office thinks it could. And if Dosunmu continues to play the way that he has been in Chicago, like I do think that a good bench player like this does bring them from a depth perspective kind of into that tier a little bit closer. But it is a win in the wake of a massive loss. And that is something that also needs to be talked about a little bit here. If this move does work, great. It is on paper a win for this team. It is a win for this front office, but it is a win because of the loss that transpired before it. You have a player who you traded essentially two first round picks for, and was a non-contributor to the rotation, and you have turned that into a very, very, very important contributor to this team's successes moving forward. So again, considering the context of the situation while also kind of talking about that trade in a vacuum, I think this trade does a lot for the Wolves.
Absolutely. Let's move on to the topic that I've been teasing for the first 40 minutes here. Giannis Antetokounmpo. Like I mentioned, the missing pick that they sent out for Rob Dillingham may have cost them Giannis Antetokounmpo. Now we don't know that. We're still kind of seeing. We still need to see how close. Maybe we never get this information. How close were the Timberwolves actually from acquiring Giannis, or was any team? It seems like the deal would have had to have been Jaden McDaniels, whether that went to Milwaukee or went to a second team like Portland to get Milwaukee's picks back to send picks. Allegedly, the Bucks wanted 5 or 6 first-round picks. To me, that would have included sending out Julius Randle as well to get picks or to go to Milwaukee, and Naz Reid. I think that was clear. Would have needed to happen. And maybe even on top of that, like Berenger would have had to go to Milwaukee as well. Maybe Shannon, if they like those teams. Like, I think that was the type of trade you were talking about. And maybe for the Wolves to get it done, on top of all that, they might have had to send out Rudy to get enough picks. We don't know, but I'm confident that, just again, not purported confidence, but just theoretical confidence, that it would have had to take at least Julius Randle, Jaden McDaniels, and Naz Reid to get this done. And I would have assumed Rob Dillingham. I think it's kind of clear Rob didn't have any meaningful value that would have swung a trade at this point. Personally, I would have been all for it. I get people's hesitancy, and I certainly get fans that just want to go. I get that it increases our title chances, but like, Jaden and Naz are my guys, and I don't, like, as a fan, I don't want to see them leave. If that people's takes, 100%. I get it. Like, you are allowed to want to keep your guys that you've fallen in love with, even if it like makes the team worse. That's your prerogative. I'm coming at it from a point of, I think trading for Giannis Antetokounmpo, assuming it was the deal I laid out, Julius, Jaden, Naz, and they're like 2030 or 2032 pick swap they still have left, I would have been all for that. I do think it would have been more or less, and it seems like they could have made this Dosunmu trade on top of it, but I would have been out for it. I kind of think it would have almost ruined this season. Like, it would have been really tough to recover for a team that is already low on players to be sending out a 3-for-1. They would have gotten a player back, but it might have just been Kuzma, which isn't really what you want. My point of view is like, and I went through this, like, players like this don't get traded. They really don't. I went back like through the history of the league, and I tried to find like, when was a level of player like this traded? So I got a list. 1965, Wilt Chamberlain traded from the Warriors to the Sixers at 28 years old. They had Hal Greer as a top 10 player. They won the championship. Wilt Chamberlain again. Lakers won the championship. Oscar Robinson to the Bucks. They won the championship. Kareem Abdul-Jabbar to the Lakers. They won 5 titles. 1982, Moses Malone. The Sixers won the title. Shaq to the Heat. They won the title. Garnett to the Celtics. They won the title. And then what I think people got more hesitancy on is the last 3-ish times. Now, the players I already listed, these were cut and dry. Like, these are similar players to Giannis. These next ones are a little bit different. 2019, Russell Westbrook to the Rockets. He wasn't the same kind of MVP level player at that point. That Rockets team, he was only there for a year, kind of fell apart. 2021, James Harden to the Nets. They probably should have won the title. Like that, I think that was a good trade for Brooklyn, honestly. And I don't think Harden was at that point in his career is as good as Giannis. And then the big one is 2023 Kevin Durant. And this one specifically, the difference between that's been the trade people bring up. The difference is Anthony Edwards right now is just way better than Devin Booker was at that same time. And so I think it would have been worth it to make this trade. But because I kind of already talked about, I think they could have filled out the roster just fine. They could have, if Rudy's the one guy left over, they could have traded Rudy for 2 starting caliber players. You fill out the roster. But ultimately, it's all moot because I don't think the Bucks are really all that close to giving up Giannis. And my big take is that if Giannis is going to get really traded at all offseason, but especially now, it was going to take Giannis pushing. It's going to take Giannis being like, no, you're trading me. You're trading me right now. And if you don't, it's going to get ugly and you're not going to, like, this is your best return right now. And he is prerogative. He's unwilling to do that. And it kind of feels like he's going to be unwilling to do that in the offseason when, if the Wolves want him, I think he's going to have to do, if the Wolves want Giannis Antetokounmpo, it's going to have to be, I'm only going to sign an extension with the Wolves, or I'm only going to sign an extension with the Wolves and X other team. And because in the offseason, there's going to be more teams that want him and can outbid the Wolves. If the Spurs lose early in the playoffs, they could go after him. When, maybe this is mean, but when the Rockets lose in the playoffs, they'll go after him potentially. If Oklahoma City wants him, they can just have him, it feels like. So it's going to take pressure from Giannis's camp to maybe even to get traded from the Bucks at all, because I just doesn't feel like the Bucks want to do it. And that's fair. That's their prerogative. I certainly at this deadline, I think they made the right choice not to trade him. But I think Giannis is costing him valuable years from his career. If he wants to be best player ever, I think he needs to not be with Milwaukee. But if he wants to be the greatest Buck player ever and spend his whole career there, that's where this is heading. But I think from the Wolves' perspective, it was, and it's going to need Giannis to push them. And unfortunately, it's hard to see that happening.
Yeah, I think the Bucks and Giannis have broken up, but they're kind of doing like the friends with benefits thing because they don't want to see each other. They don't want to never see each other again and go find partners for themselves.
The joke was when the Bucks put out there like they're going to try to woo him in the offseason. The joke was like having the baby to save the marriage was the common joke online.
Yeah, that's also pretty close to like, hey, like we're done here, but also to like it'd be really hard to never see each other again. And they are wasting valuable years of their lives from maybe finding their soulmates ultimately. And so I think the thing here with the Giannis stuff is I'm with you. I do think too. I mean, this might be a little bit more of a hot take, but the thing with Giannis is if the Wolves trade for him from a talent perspective, he's the best player the franchise has ever seen to this date from a talent perspective. And I think that makes it
I think it'd be
unique.
the best 2-man pairing since Shaq and Kobe.
That is fair to say, and I think
from a
that
talent perspective.
yeah, I think that's fair to say, and I think the difference too with this in a Kevin Durant trade or a James Harden trade is like at those points, neither of them were a bona fide top three player in the league. I mean, this is like
Hmm.
Giannis's two, I think, at this point. Like, I don't think it's really much of an argument that he's either two or three. So,
I
um,
think three, SJ and Jokic are pretty incredible.
yeah, for sure. I mean, I think that's fair. So I think there's those elements that I think made me be like, yeah, I mean, go for it. Like, see if you can make this thing happen. And if absolutely nothing else, I mean, this is a can't miss team over the next 5 years. Um, the flip side of that coin is it would give anybody pause to let go of Naz Reid, Julius Randle, and Jaden McDaniels.
Yep.
And whatever you're giving up, I mean, it is clear in this day and age that winning under this current CBA that we spent 10 minutes talking about earlier is that depth is extremely important. And what you would be doing with this Giannis move is you would essentially be eviscerating your depth to say, okay, we got two of the best players in the world. And let's see if these teams let's see if any team in the playoffs can stop us. And oftentimes the answer to that question is yes. That if you have two players that are all world, I mean, in a 7 game series, a championship caliber team is going to probably end up finding a way to shut the water off. And so there are elements there that would give me pause about the trade, but ultimately I would be very much so for it. And you never know what a Jade McDaniels becomes on a Milwaukee team that is probably tanking. I think Naz Reid, this is my personal opinion. I do think Naz Reid is pretty close to his ceiling. Um, uh, Julius Randle clearly at his ceiling. And so it is a trade where you give up a lot of options for one seismic, gigantic um, option. Um, and again, I thought the whole thing was weird because it did feel like for, a day that the Wolves were closing in on this thing from the reporting
It
that was
did feel like that,
happening.
yeah.
Yeah, like it had all of the elements of, a big NBA trade happening where a team just keeps getting reported for like 48 hours and then inevitably it does end up happening at the right time. Um, so it did feel like that. It did feel like that for a while, but then it comes out afterwards that the Bucks were never really that close. It just feels so weird. Um, and this is going to be something that just continues to happen because clearly clearly Giannis was kind of shopping himself around a little bit last offseason with the New York rumors that were swirling. And now
Hmm.
this year, like there's been some cryptic stuff in post game pressers with him. I mean, clearly his agent is doing a little bit of work on his side too. Um, and it is going to happen once again into this offseason. And it is clearly at this point in both parties' best interest to cut bait and move on. And seeing Giannis might get shut down for the rest of the year too. Like it's just so weird at this point. Um, and I understand the Bucks not maybe making the move at the deadline just in order to gauge the market and see if they can get a little bit more in the offseason when teams are able to offer more picks. Frankly, it's the smart thing to do. And any GM or any front office with any savviness or any sort of savviness would do that. So it doesn't necessarily surprise me. What does surprise me is how close it sounded like things were getting. And then ultimately, in retrospect, doing the 2020 hindsight thing, the reports were, it never really got that close.
Yeah, and we'll have to see. I'm interested to see what sort of reporting we get about what happened there. Maybe Tim Connolly will address it to the media. I doubt he'll lay the cards on the table, especially because he'd be talking about a player that's not on his team. But I guess we'll see, and we'll certainly revisit this in June, where you mentioned it's in both teams' best interest. At the moment, it was not in the Bucks' best interest, but that'll change, I believe, come the offseason. But I still think it's probably going to take Giannis pushing.
And ultimately, Ryan, what I would say is what ended up happening at the trade deadline was the sensible move for the Timberwolves. I mean, this was the right, sensible, common sense move to make is keep the current core intact, bring in a high level bench guard that can score, that can defend, bench wing guard that can score and defend, one of the one of the trade targets that's been being talked about now for the Wolves for 2 years. I mean, Ayo Dosunmu and it has been talked about as a good fit for the Wolves for the last year and a half. And ultimately, like, yes, you strike out on the Giannis stuff, but it does lead you to do something that was desperately needed, the best possible move for the roster that you currently have right now. And ultimately now, like, we're going to see over these next couple months if this team, if this group has kind of hit its ceiling of like Western Conference Finals, like maybe you can get to a finals. Or if it is really another year of growth, another year of seasoning, with a little bit of extra boost off the bench here, is ultimately very beneficial and will inform kind of some off-season decisions here. So I do think it is. Yes. I mean, I think there's some disappointment there because Giannis is ultimately not going to be in a Wolves uniform on or tonight or even on Sunday against the Clippers. But it ultimately led for the smart, sensible, common sense move for the Wolves to make. And we're going to learn a lot about this team here in the next couple months.
Yeah, and absolutely. And as much as I wanted Giannis, I didn't hate this path either. It, like you already mentioned, it makes a lot of sense, and we'll all the NBA world revisit this in June and July. Did want to wrap up just talking about the remaining, just kind of the path forward for the Wolves here, because you get so caught up in the deadline, you kind of forget where the Wolves are. So they're currently sitting 6th in the Western Conference. They're a game up on Phoenix in 7th. They're tied games backwise with Houston and the Lakers, who have played 2 fewer games and have 1 fewer win and loss. And they're a game back of Denver, who is Denver's in a tough spot right now because they've been missing Aaron Gordon, still missing time. Peyton Watson got hurt recently. He's going to miss weeks or a month or two. The path to a top 3 seed is still wide open and right there for the Wolves. And the reward for that top 3 seed is unbelievably high. Especially as, well, San Antonio could catch Oklahoma City. Like, that's not impossible. I think Oklahoma City after the deadline will probably start ripping off wins like they always do, but they're only 4.5 back, and SGA for these next couple games is gonna be out. But let's just assume OKC 1 and San Antonio 2. If the Wolves can get up to 3 and pass Denver, that's gonna push OKC and Denver to the opposite side of the bracket. Basically like last year, which I think those are the 2 teams that, to me, is healthy Denver, are the favorites in the West. So if you can get up to 3, again, you're 1 back of Denver, and Denver is still dealing with injuries. Houston, ton of injuries. Lakers just haven't really looked all that impressive all year. And Denver and LA have a much more difficult schedule than the Wolves. Houston has a travel schedule that's impossible. The path to the top 3 seed is wide open, and to get up to 3 and say it's 2 San Antonio, 3 Wolves, 4, 5 Denver, Houston, 6 Lakers, like, that is like unbelievably a perfect. It's basically what they got last year, where they played the Lakers in the first round, and then San Antonio would be a much tougher task, even if Curry were healthy. San Antonio's a much better team than that Warriors team last year, but that's the stakes going down the stretch. And we do this a lot, but like, last 4 games of the deadline: Pelicans, Zombie Clippers, Hawks, and Trailblazers. It'd be really nice to go into the break with a 5-game winning streak, adding on the comeback win in Toronto on Wednesday. That's the stakes, and it does kind of remind me of when you play a team is so important. Like, Charlotte has been like the best team in the NBA nearly for the past month. The Wolves don't play them at all during this hot stretch. Who knows how they're playing by April when the Wolves see them, and the Hornets on November 1st when they played them the first time didn't look all that spectacular. And then the Clippers, who they play on Sunday, is a good example of this. 2 p.m. Super Bowl Sunday. Sorry, I saddled you with that one, covering that game.
Hey, we'll
like
make
the
it
Clippers,
work.
like, they're not. I haven't looked at. I don't think Garland will be playing in that for the Clippers. But like, they don't have Zubats. They don't. Harden traded away. Like, the Clippers played solid basketball for the past month. and the Wolves didn't play them at all. And then maybe like you could pick out, I'm sure you can pick out the opposite of that. Like maybe the Hawks played the best game of their season against the Wolves. Like obviously but the Wolves have gotten fortunate in the aggregate with this sort of stuff. And it's kind of at the point where like they don't have an excuse to not be the 3 seed at this point, and it's still in front of them.
Yep, and the 6-game homestand is important because it's going to gauge how checked in they are after the trade deadline. Obviously, it was a team that was very distracted with all of the things that were circling over the last week, and now you have a pretty healthy homestand here. Last year, they were about 500 at home, which was pretty ridiculous, and this year they're 17-8. So clearly a little bit of improvement there from a home game perspective. Now, a lot of those wins came against bad teams, but again, another thing they've struggled with historically. So that's what I'm going to be looking for is, does this team kind of trot into the All-Star break, or do they just kind of like drag their feet and say, well, we're playing some bad teams, like maybe we play a little bit of uninspired basketball here over the next few days? That's going to be at least the biggest thing that I will be looking for, because especially too, like history says, when they do have these big homestands, like they do tend to look pretty bad towards the end of them. Like they need to get out on the road and get on a more structured schedule and just play a few road games. Sometimes the comfortability aspect with this team can set in, and you know they get high on their own supply maybe. So it's one of those things that, you know, 6-game homestand, big deal for the players who are just traded for to get acclimated and like get used to the facility, you know, maybe find a place for the rest of the year to stay. So that's a very important thing. But the hope here and what you got to look for the next few is just how much ground can they make up in those standings, and like you said, maybe string together a 5-game win streak heading into the All-Star break, because it is very advantageous to have this many home games right before the break.
Yep, and it starts with this next game against the Pelicans, where the Wolves are nearly double-digit favorites. Not that stopped them from playing poorly. Certainly, if we did this pod at halftime of the Raptors game, I think we would have had some pretty negative things to say, with the caveat of the deadline looming at the time. But yeah, it's an opportunity for the Wolves to really, I think that the Wolves' chances of making the finals just go skyrocketing. Not skyrocketing, but like it goes from like single digits to double digits percent if you can get the proper seed that that your talent on this roster kind of indicate, and the health that talent has had indicate. But we'll see. Hopefully they can. I mean, I would probably predict 3 out of 4 just knowing them, but maybe I do get like doldrums of the season, all that stuff, but maybe there's like a sense of like, yeah, these are the tough times of the season, but with the All-Star break really like in front of you, maybe like, guys, let's just play hard for a week and we can all go to, except for like we can go to the Bahamas after this or whatever for a few days. Yeah, but that'll be.
And knowing that this is the group, and Mike Conley is going to be en route back, you know, this is the group. No one's on their way out anymore. Ayo Dosunmu is here. A little bit of reinforcements are coming off the bench. And by the way, Mike Conley will be here in a couple weeks too. So nothing to really worry about. We're good for another season. Maybe that gives them a little bit of a boost.
Absolutely. And I'll be at Target Center for this game against New Orleans. I'm bracing myself to go into the locker room and check out, because he's not technically on the roster, Mike's empty locker, which I'm sure is just they close the door on it and they remove the plaque to be put right back up in a week or so, or whenever that gets officially done. But yeah, for Andrew, I'm Ryan. Thank you everyone for listening. Go Wolves.
Ayo.